You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. I'm your host, Dan Heaton, and today's guest is Seth Kubersky, who is the author of The Unofficial Guide to Universal Orlando. He's also a blogger for touringplans.com and Orlando Weekly, and has written other books, been involved with books on Disneyland and Universal, of course, and other parks in Orlando. And our topic today is Universal Orlando, what they're currently doing, where they're heading, how their approach differs from what Disney is doing, and just how both companies are fighting so hard to draw guests in Orlando. It's such an interesting time for the industry, and I think Seth was a perfect person to talk to learn more from his perspective, being on the ground in Orlando, about what's going on and what could be going on in the future. So I hope you like the conversation. It'll start in just a moment. Okay, my guest today is Seth Kubersky, who is a very prolific blogger and author. He's an expert on theme parks, especially in Orlando. And he's got a new book that we're called The Unofficial Guide to Universal Orlando, which came out this summer. And I'm excited to have you on the show. Seth, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me on, Dan. I'm really happy to talk to you about it.
Great. Well, before we get into the book, I'm curious, given how much you're doing with theme parks, how did you get started even interested in this, like as a child or as an adult? What got you into theme parks?
Well, as a little kid, the first theme parks I can remember going to were actually little parks in New Jersey, the land of make-believe, fairy tale forest. But the biggest impression, of course, was family trips to Disney World, which came, every 4 or 5 years. And I still have the map that used to hung up above my bed, 1979 Magic Kingdom map. Still have that on my wall. So yeah, Disney made a huge impression on me. I became interested in Universal from the first time I in about '92, and then again in '94. And when I graduated college, '96 with a degree in theater, I came down to Orlando, and while waiting to be interviewed at Disney, I got hired at Universal. So I'm already a fan of the parks. I already had an annual pass from the second I moved down here. Um, but to be able to work in the park and see it from the other side really cemented my appreciation for theme parks. I like to say that there are two truly American art forms. One is jazz, and the other is theme parks. Um,
Yeah, I think that you have an interesting perspective because there's so many people like myself that have only seen that one side of going to the parks. But how do you feel like with Universal and with doing this book that your time working there in the 90s kind of make how does it help you out?
Well, a lot of the operational principles were established then. Obviously, things changed greatly, but the knowledge of the day-to-day job of the frontline employees is essentially the same, and having an appreciation for what they go through. I started out as a stage technician working on the Ghostbusters show, may it rest in peace, and I worked on everything from Terminator to Barney to Mardi Gras to Halloween, and having an empathy for the employees and understanding, what their jobs are, makes it easier to understand how to best navigate it as a consumer. To know where the bottlenecks are, to know where the problem places are, and to know the right things to say to ease your way through the system. And the other side is that working there, there's still a lot of the people I work side by side with, are either still in the park or involved in the industry. And having those contacts and being kept up to date on what's on behind the scenes was really invaluable in trying to write a book and getting it up to date.
Definitely. And I mean, so after you worked at Universal, I mean, then you've done a lot of writing over the years. So what made you kind of get into the writing side of covering the parks in that way?
You know what? I really have to thank Jim Hill. He has a website which I started just commenting on posts that he wrote, and he liked my comments enough to let me write some articles for him, and that led to me getting in touch with my first publisher, for which I wrote a different Universal Orlando guidebook for several years, and that eventually branched into me writing local newspaper, the Orlando Weekly, where I covered the theme parks, and led me to meet Bob Selinger, who created the Unofficial Guide series. And I got the opportunity to work on the Disneyland guide. I've done five editions of that now, and with everything happening at Universal with Diagon Alley and new water park and just overall expansion, and we decided it was time that Universal deserved its own book, and it's kind of a weird, surreal thing that I remember getting the Unofficial Guide as a kid and planning out vacations with it when I was in high school, and now to be writing for it is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I have unofficial guides at home that I still have from like 1996 and all these
Oh,
years, and
oh
it's
yeah,
crazy.
I think I've still got my 88 or my 89.
Wow. So you're even ahead
Yeah.
of me. So yeah, you already kind of mentioned it, but had you guys been thinking about doing a book like this for a little while, or was it really, I mean, what made this the perfect time or the right time to do a full book on Universal
Well,
Orlando?
the short answer is Diagon Alley. Um, that from when the first Harry Potter expansion opened in 2010, we started thinking about it, and is there enough material, and more importantly, is there enough interest? And the Universal's market, while it's still dwarfed by Disney, has been steadily increasing since 2010. And by the opening of Diagon Alley and the kind of worldwide media attention they got, um, we decided that this is the time. Uh, you know, Universal Orlando, if you look at it now, the number of attractions it has, the number of hotel rooms it has, it's roughly on par with what Walt Disney World was when the Unofficial Guide to Walt Disney World first started, back when it was just the Magic Kingdom and Epcot and a handful of hotels. And Universal's got so much depth and detail, and you've got Volcano Bay coming on soon. This book we cover Wet and Wild, but we also give information on Volcano Bay. Hotels coming. It was time. It was too much to cram into just a chapter in the Walt Disney World book anymore.
Right, and that's what's so nice about it is it's not, I mean, it gets beyond the attractions and you have so much more space. So how much, I mean, obviously a lot of it was brand new, but I mean, how much of it was just starting from scratch rather than from other books like that you've done like Beyond Disney and others?
Well, I will say, even though that my name is on the cover, that there's a lot of Bob Selinger and Len Testa in this book, because, you know, we've been covering Universal for the Unofficial Guide for many years, and I'd say, you know, a good 20 to 50% of the book has its origins in stuff we've already published, but in a way, it's almost easier to write something from scratch than to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and revise every entry and update every thing that we've ever written before about Universal, which is what we did, or what I did for the book, and then writing a whole lot of new material we've never covered before, about Universal special events, um, expanded information about the hotels, and also a huge amount of new dining information, which Derek Bergen was really instrumental in helping me out, because no one can eat at Universal like Derek Bergen can.
Yeah, well, his short little top six that was in there, I thought was a nice touch, to pull
Oh,
from the Touring Plans blog.
oh
So
yeah, that's one of our most popular features, and we couldn't have a Universal book without fitting that in.
yeah, and another thing I really like is the introduction, where which I'm a big Disney fan and a Universal fan, but I did really enjoy all kind of the little jabs at Disney with the Universal difference. And I mean, how fun was it to do that without going too far and like just being a little too tough on Disney?
Yeah, I didn't mean to offend anyone, and I'm not so much really trying to take jabs. There's some snarky and snide comments on that. Unofficial guide, we've got an attitude. It's
Yeah.
it's part of a sense of humor. That's part of what we do. I'm a huge Disney fan. I grew up a Disney fan. I'm still a Disney fan. I love Disneyland. I write the Disneyland guidebook. Um, but I have issues with what the Walt Disney World experience has become for the average guest. The person who isn't an expert, who hasn't written a book about it, who's saved up for that once in a lifetime trip, and don't quite know what they're stumbling into, because the Walt Disney World today isn't the Walt Disney World of 10 or 15 years ago in terms of ease of use. But the Universal experience, especially for people who stay on site, really reminds me of what Walt Disney World was back in its golden days, before it got so huge and so overwhelming and so all-consuming. Um, and and so, we have a lot of people who, they buy our Walt Disney World books, and they subscribe to our plans, and they put a huge amount of time and effort and psychic energy into planning a Walt Disney World vacation down to the nth degree. And so I think that introduction was kind of say, this is a different kind of experience, and you have to have a different kind of mindset going in. At least for now, Universal doesn't require that degree of military precision, and that's one of the chief things that sets Universal apart for right now.
Yeah, and I really like that about Universal, and just I mean, especially I went there. I have young girls, so right now I'm holding back a little bit, but we went there a few years ago, and went an off season, and we basically showed up and just kind of strolled around and saw everything. We didn't have front of the line express or anything. And you mentioned that Disney's different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. It's different than it was 3 years ago. I mean, with FastPass Plus. Now, the flip side of this is with Universal growing, I mean, it would take years, but is there a point where Universal's going to start to move in that area? Because we want them to grow and add things, but could they have capacity issues like we're seeing at the Magic Kingdom right now?
What's going on at the Magic Kingdom right now, especially in September and October this year, is really unprecedented. There is no more low season. Instead, in what would traditionally be some of the slowest times of the year, we're seeing waits that go between Thanksgiving level and Easter level, which is insane. Um, we're not seeing that at Universal. We're seeing decent crowds in line, or slightly above, what we would traditionally expect, but nothing compared to what we're seeing at Walt Disney World. And at Touring Plans, we're trying to figure out what is causing this, because it's not necessarily more people in Orlando. Hotel occupancy rates are not up that much. Um, so we're trying to figure out, is this an issue of capacity at the Magic Kingdom? Is this the effect of FastPass? But for now, yeah, Universal is still a much less stressful experience, if you're someone who's allergic to lines.
Yeah, and I even saw it. I don't think it's to the level it was now, but when I was in Orlando last January at the Magic Kingdom, where the other parks seemed similar, the Magic Kingdom seemed just jammed. And I mean, we could go off and do a whole nother podcast probably about the reasons for that.
Yeah.
But it's actually good, a little good to hear though, that it's interesting to hear that the occupancy isn't different. So I think a lot of it might have to do with some of the other Disney parks being redone or not be drawing the same amount, but we won't know that till the numbers really start to pan out. But one of the things about Universal that I think is an is so valued is how compact it is.
Mm.
And what amazes me is how they're building new hotels and Volcano Bay, and how they seem to still be finding ways to do all this in such a limited amount of space. So when do they hit the point where they say we have to buy a bunch more land? I mean, they have the Wet and Wild land, they have some space, but how far are they from needing to do a huge land investment?
Well, Wet and Wild is the next target. I don't expect to see a theme park on that land. I think what we're looking at Wet and Wild is hotels and maybe some sort of shopping or entertainment district. A secondary city walk possibly. At parking, it would also be a smart thing to put there. But I don't think that land is right for a theme park. There's ways that they could expand. The best way they could possibly expand would be across the street, across Kirkman Road, where you have some hotels and restaurants. But they're owned by a bunch of different owners, and assembling that all could be challenging. The Lockheed Martin land that they gave up years ago is also up for auction very soon. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But for now, they're really being smart about maximizing every square inch in their existing parks. There's one big expansion pad left in Universal Studios Florida, in between the Simpsons building and Men in Black, which could potentially be used. And you might see it, if not used, at least gone right up to the edge of it for Nintendo. Um, IOA is pretty much maxed out now that Kong is being built, but you're going to see a lot of changes in the existing islands, starting with Marvel. So they're going to go around the parks, I think, in the next few years and make everything up to the level of Harry Potter. That's the goal.
Right. And
Before they start breaking outside the berm, so to speak.
well, the benefit, I mean, I don't know if you call it a benefit, is they do have some things like Sinbad or even Poseidon's Fury, or, some of the areas that I think that are gorgeous in spots, but that they could swap out for Harry Potter or something else. So they're not so locked in terms of, and it's cheaper if you have some infrastructure in place.
Yeah. I don't necessarily know anymore. The plan is to expand the footprint of Harry Potter, at least in IOA. Fear Factor could become the Ministry of Magic someday. But I personally, I don't have any inside information on this per se, but I would love to see Dragon Challenge retired, and that's a huge plot of land that could be used for several much more family-friendly experiences.
Right, because especially you notice it before Diagon Alley opened, that when you go to that area, is that those are amazing coasters, but they do feel a little out of place compared to the rest of it, because they theme the queue and everything, but they're still big steel coasters.
Sure. And
So
especially now that you have to have a very unmagical metal detector experience before riding, that just breaks the theme. It's time for it to go away.
yeah, no, I love those coasters, but I can't argue with that. So talking all about the growth that we're seeing with Universal, I mean the big one is obviously Kong coming, and then in Hollywood we have Harry Potter. Do you think, is next year the year that a Universal park passes one of the Disney parks, whether it's DCA or Animal Kingdom or Hollywood Studios? Is next year the year where we could see that happening?
Um, it, you're referring to the TEA ACOM
Yeah, and
report.
if assuming those numbers are accurate, which
In
is another
my
question.
gut feeling, that already happened uh, in 2014. At least in the second half of the year, there's no way on earth that you can legitimately claim that Universal didn't have significantly more people than Hollywood Studios or uh, Animal Kingdom or even Epcot
Right.
on the majority of days. So I don't know how those numbers come up. I think that if they are legitimate, then yes, you will see that happen soon. But Disney is masterful at manipulating their crowd flow and manipulating their distribution of guests to make sure that that doesn't happen. So, I can't imagine, especially Hollywood studios. The power of Frozen, and I guess next the power of Star Wars is the only thing keeping that place afloat.
Yeah, it's crazy because you look at that park, which probably will be amazing in 5 6 years, but there just seems to be such an opportunity. Like, I mean, I'm looking at the construction photos of Kong and how massive it looks, and the fact that it. I mean, I know it's not. I'm not going to take a 3-year-old on it, but the height requirement being so low that I mean, how big can Kong be? Are we? I mean, not you yourself, but are fans and people underestimating just how huge could it be, almost on the level, maybe not of Potter, but pretty close?
I don't think you can underestimate the power of nostalgia among Universal fans and film fans. Kong is really loved. All the classic Universal attractions are really loved. Like, I was yesterday at Universal for Back to the Future Day, October 21st, and the throngs of people out to meet Doc Brown at 4:29 p.m. were just crazy. And seeing the merchandise flying off the shelves. That I think that if Kong is as good as it sounds and looks like it's going to be, and I know some folks who got a private tour of it today, and massive is an excellent word. That's a word you're going to hear a lot. Um,
Yeah, it looks. I mean, I think actually I remember seeing the video, and I think that's the word that the guy kept using over and over to describe it. They're like, it's the biggest thing, but that's where I think you add that in, plus with Fast and the Furious, which drew a lot of people to Hollywood with the traffic jams and whatnot. It seems like, I know Disney has made some big announcements, and I'll be thrilled to see what they do. But there seems to be like a few years here where, not even worrying about the ACOM numbers, obviously, where Universal almost, I mean, I know Frozen is coming next year and that's going to draw people to Epcot, but there seems to be a real time where I feel like if Universal plays this smart, they can continue to gain people and fans.
well, I think what Universal is doing intelligently is that they're playing the long game. Disney, to a certain extent, um, coasts on nostalgia. It coasts on the fact that people of my generation and generation before me grew up with Disney, and it makes it a deep emotional connection, a family tradition. And what I think Universal is trying to do is saying that it can't counteract that necessarily, but what it can do is create new memories for the young generation today in hopes that it'll pay off down the line. And if Disney isn't creating new things to appeal to that generation to the same degree, then they risk losing that emotional bond that sustained them this far.
Right, like because I went to Disney World so much as a kid. So I have that bond. So now I'm taking my kids. But that I brought this up with Sam Genoway also, this question of kind of the legacy fans, because Universal doesn't have that because one reason, I mean, it's just different, but they've swapped out every attraction but ET pretty much. But with Potter and with other things, could that's the big question. Could they be at this moment creating legacy fans that 10, 15 years from now Disney blinks and all of a sudden they've lost the game?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because like I said, the first time I visited Universal was '92, and then working there from '96 to 2000, uh, where you had, on my lunch break, I would skip lunch and instead go and ride either Kong or Back to the Future or Jaws almost every day. And yeah, I think there's still some people like me who remember things like Murder, She Wrote and Alfred Hitchcock, and kind of, are nostalgic for those old days. But I think Harry Potter, especially, and the Minions to a lesser
Mhm.
extent, are really Universal's bid for creating those lasting memories that they'll be able to sustain over the course of a generation. I don't know if Minions will still be popular 20 years from now. But I think Harry Potter has the potential to be almost a timeless franchise for them. Maybe the technology on the rides will have to improve at some point, but Pirates and Haunted Mansion are still going strong, and they don't need their technology improved, even if they do it sometime anyway.
Even if they add some new little effect to connect to the movie or something. Um, but no, you bring up a good point. I actually visited I was a teenager, and I think I visited I want to say it was 91 or 92, and saw Murder She Wrote and Alfred Hitchcock, and Kong, which broke down forever, an earthquake. And that was such an interesting park. And I mean, part of me is sad because I would love if Back to the Future was still there, with no offense to The Simpsons. But the one benefit is, by swapping things out, you're able to experience the Revenge of the Mummy and Transformers and some of the things that I mean, I love Disney, and I'll be going there again fairly soon. But there are parts of me where I would never want them to close Pirates or Haunted Mansion. But there's some middle ground there that you'd like to see some movement towards more high tech things
They can take
sometimes.
Stitch any day they want. It,
Right. Or,
you know,
anytime.
no, what I think is interesting is Universal is the only major theme park I know of where every single e-ticket in the park has changed over. Can you think of another one where if you visited the park 10 years ago, you wouldn't recognize anything that's there currently? Um,
I
it,
cannot.
it,
Even local
yeah,
parks, I can't think.
ET is really now ET and to an extent the horror makeup show are really the last vestiges of the opening day park. What I think is really fascinating is, and this kind of even goes back more than a decade to a column I once wrote for Jim Hill. Disney, especially the Disneyland style parks, have always been the kind of epitome of mid-century modernism in the sense of creating a quote unquote realistic but perfected space, of the perfect sight lines and creating a full environment. And then Universal came along and was kind of the postmodern theme park, in the sense that you could see all the seams and you saw all the sound stages and you knew it was all just a facade, and it was all about peeking behind the curtain. And now Universal is going around and turning itself from a postmodern park into a modernist park, in the sense of once again creating full environments. When you're in Diagon Alley, you don't see the facades, you don't see the back of the show buildings. You just see that universe, and that's kind of more the Disney model. And to see Universal taking that model and in a way even improving on it is, I think, really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is, with the Star Wars announcements and such, is that they've created, and I mean, they've obviously, like you said, built on what Disney did. So I wouldn't say they created from scratch, but they've taken that to the next level. And now you're seeing Disney now sort of doing a similar thing. They're basing it on IP. They're having a land theme to one property, and they're making them immersive in that way. And granted, you can go back to New Orleans Square, and there's immersive lands that Disney did forever ago.
Absolutely.
But this IP focus, it's interesting. And I mean, and Avatar obviously coming much sooner, which we could that's a whole nother story. But it's interesting to see how, in a way, like, Disney pulled Universal a certain way, and now Universal is pulling Disney a different way, and it's mostly good in both directions for us, unless you really aren't tied to all IP based attractions.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think people forget how from opening day Disney was always about IP. It was you use IP because it's a story and characters that the guests are already familiar with, and you don't have to educate them. So, you always had Snow White and Pinocchio and Mr. Toad, who the guests already knew and were IP. Disney didn't invent any of those characters. Um, and yeah, there are the classics of Disney like the Space Mountains and the Pirates of the Caribbean. But even so, those were based on really clear, iconic genres that people were already familiar with. You didn't have to explain to people what pirates are. So, I think a lot of times when people think of original ride, they think of having to create a whole new universe, and how do you explain that to a guest in the length of a 4-minute ride? So I think IP is here to stay. But I think that what Universal did was say, we're not just going to take this IP and slap a name on a ride and then just have you exit through a gift shop saying, I survived t-shirts.
Mm.
That the theming of the food, the theming of all the merchandise, the employees being in character, the costumes, down to the trash cans, in a way that Disney, kind of aspired to, but really doesn't truly do. Even if you look at Cars Land, which is my favorite spot in any domestic Disney park. Really gorgeous design and beautiful, beautiful decor everywhere. But the actual experience, except for the e-ticket ride, the rides really aren't that much in the theme. The food isn't necessarily in the theme. Um, it's not the same kind of 360 immersive experience. Now, when Avatar and Star Wars come online, then we'll see if they really bring it up to that level.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point in terms of the food and the merchandising because, you think about it in terms of what Universal obviously Forbidden Journey is an amazing ride. The Hogwarts queue is amazing. But the things that really probably are making them so much money, especially at the first iteration, Hogsmeade, are the wands
The
and the butterbeer.
they paid for that. They practically paid for that thing in butterbeer. Um, yeah, and now that there are so many different varieties, it started out as just butterbeer, and now you've got hot butterbeer, you've got fire whiskey, you've got all these different kinds of drinks, and I think that the way they were able to do it is one, um, when you taste all these things, it tastes the way that you would imagine it from reading the books and seeing the movies, and more importantly, they all pretty much taste good. If they had been the kind of thing that people took one sip of and threw out and never bought again, then they wouldn't be selling the way they are. The fact that they, didn't just take an existing product and slap a label on it, but took the time to make something that tasted authentic and enjoyable. Um, that's a real difference. You don't see that a lot in this industry.
Yeah, and I expect on that note, I mean, there's not a butterbeer for Star Wars. There may be in some,
Blue Mill, Blue
extended
Mill.
universe. Okay.
Everyone's going to be drinking Blue Mill.
Well, again, it has to be good. But I am sure, judging by even what Iger said on stage about there's going to, how immersive it'll
Hmm.
be and they're going to have droids walking around, Avatar may have some of that. But I think, and I don't want to downplay Avatar because it may surprise us, but I think Star Wars is where we're really going to see them take their best shot. Now, they've already tried to do things like that with the LeFou's brew and some of the different things they've tried to kind of pull a butterbeer, but it's not the same because people, like you said, don't go in already having an expectation of what it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the tough thing. Harry Potter is kind of the perfect IP for that kind of thing because there are so many scenes in those books and movies of people eating or drinking things, and descriptions of what these things are, and you don't have that in a lot of other IPs. Be Our Guest is probably the closest, but even that, Be Our Guest is a really gorgeous restaurant and better than average food for a theme park. But when I see that movie and I see dancing plates and I see a whole musical number, that's what I want to see when I pay for a very expensive meal at Be Our Guest. And having a photo op with the Beast is great, but it's not the same thing. So we'll see,
Yeah.
if they can achieve that kind of level.
Yeah, there's really a limit to, I mean, Harry Potter is one of those franchises. I mean, those don't come around very often to have, I mean, where it just seamlessly flowed, and I give Universal and J.K. Rowling, credit. So the challenge really is that Harry Potter is such a unique thing because you have all of these different elements that can so seamlessly flow. And Universal could have easily, though, spent the same amount of money and put Harry Potter on it and drawn some crowds. But the fact that they put all these details in, I think, like you mentioned, this could go on for a while. These lands, I think, have more staying power, like something like a New Orleans Square or Haunted Mansion or something, because they have such an attention to detail, and Harry Potter has the extra edge of people coming in with so much connection already.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the people, you know, the e-tickets maybe are what get the headlines, and get people in the gate, but the reason that they stay in an area and they spend time and they spend money is because of those little details. Watching people spend hours just walking through Nocturne Alley and playing with the wands and watching the shows. The Gringotts coaster might draw them in, but it's the detail that keeps them there. Um, you know,
Right.
you know, is Star Wars going to be the same when it's not the planets or the areas that we've all seen on the screen, but some made up, mashed up fictional planet? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure about that. But if they can get the details right and they can have everything match the theme so that you don't feel constantly taken out of it and being in just another theme park, then Disney will have a huge winner on their hands, and we will stop talking about Harry Potter for a while.
Yeah, and that's where it's on Universal, I'm sure, is thinking ahead to, trying to stay on top of things, even with when those, beforehand or whenever Star Wars actually opens, which is still kind of up in the air. But it's tricky because I grew up in the 80s, and Star Wars I probably have seen more than any other movie as a kid. But you're right that all those things that I was attached to, like flying through the Death Star, which you sort of did in the original Star Tours, or Hoth or Tatooine or some of the characters, they're trying to tie these new lands more into the new films. And while everything about the new films from the trailers looks amazing, there's always a risk with that.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I bought my tickets. I couldn't get for opening night in IMAX, but I'm going on Friday morning, and I'm thrilled. I'm excited, but I also remember being thrilled and excited for Phantom Menace. So the long term Star Wars fan in me is still, just holding back a tiny bit. But yeah, the buzz is good. Um, so hopefully the movies will be successful, and hopefully there'll be enough kind of timeless elements that tie the series together, that the new attractions will appeal to both our generation and the new generation. Um, because you can't root it just in nostalgia. Um, but you know obviously, yeah, I'm more attached to the classic trilogy, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, kind of bridging that a bit. So, there's still, I'm just going to ask a few more questions here, but here's a big one I wanted to ask you. So, there's still some Disney fans that, no matter what Universal brings out, they're saying, I go to Disney World, I love Disney World, and, more power to them. Disney World's amazing. But if somebody asks you what is the short pitch to someone like that who likes theme parks, doesn't mind, is okay with thrills, but just isn't focused on Universal. What's the pitch you give them to say you're missing out?
The pitch is that Universal is newer, it's fresher, it's more advanced, and it's a lot less stressful. It's a better value for your money right now.
Hey, I can't, I would love to argue with it, but it's hard to though. So yeah, that's a clear pitch. So beyond Harry Potter, last quick little tidbit question for you. What are your favorite, like what's currently in the parks now? What's your favorite attraction at each park if you pull Harry Potter out of
Ooh,
it?
if you pull out, if we're talking rides, um, I do like Revenge of the Mummy a lot, but the effects need to be cleaned up. Men in Black is still my go-to. I can ride Men in Black over and over, and still try for that 999,999. I've gotten it a few times, but I can't quite do it consistently. My favorite attraction in the studios would have to be the horror makeup show. Some of the best actors you'll find anywhere, and still a funny script. No matter how many times you see it, I still laugh. And over at IOA, I don't think you can beat Spider-Man. I love Forbidden Journey. I love Gringotts. I love a lot of other rides, but Spider-Man is still, I think, one of the best rides in the world.
Yeah, I would argue that, I mean, Spider-Man, I don't know if it's in terms of nostalgia and such, but is in my top few attractions I've ever ridden. I still can't totally figure out. I'm still amazed by the fact you're not actually going up in the air and stuff, and you're staying flat on the ground.
Yeah,
like how
I
they
got
do it.
stopped and evac once at that exact spot, and it was kind of cool to see just how big those moving walls are to make you feel like you're going up.
Yeah, and I would argue Men in Black is still, as far as immersive, as good as any shooting attraction or
Oh,
interactive
I,
attraction
I
can be.
I would rather ride that than Buzz Lightyear or Toy Story any day.
Yeah. So I want to close out. I want to ask you: are you currently working on beyond the next year's version? I would assume. Are you currently working on any other books or large projects right
Well,
now?
I just finished work on Beyond Disney, which is our guide to Busch Gardens, SeaWorld, iDrive. It also has some Universal coverage and lots of small attractions in the Orlando area. So that should be hitting shelves anytime now. And, I write for the newspaper, and I'm working on updating touringplanets.com. But I don't get started on my next round of books until probably February, where I'll be working on the Unofficial Guide to Las Vegas again, and then getting started on Disneyland. And there's a lot of changes at Disneyland.
Oh well, those sound great, and I definitely want to make a pitch for your best day ever or best week. I apologize.
Best week ever.
Your touring plan,
I
best
did
week ever.
not
Your
come up
touring
with that
plans things.
title. I inherited that title, but it's a little tongue in cheek. But yeah, that's a
No,
fun
those are
column to
fun.
write.
Yeah, I look forward to them every week. So if somebody wants to find you on the internet, what is the best place to find
On
you?
Twitter, I'm at SKUBERSKY, S. Kubersky. And I've got a website, SethKubersky.com. And I'm on touringplans.com and OrlandoWeekly.com.
All right. Well, Seth, thanks so much for being on the show. This was a lot of fun, and hopefully you can come back the next time you're doing a book or a project, or when Universal has new things.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk to you again.
I want to give a big thanks to Seth for being on the podcast and talking about Universal. There's so much going on there that's interesting, and it's exciting to hear from someone with so much knowledge and insight into what's happening. And if you're planning a trip to Universal or just a big fan, I think the Unofficial Guide to Universal Orlando is a great resource. And you can also follow what Seth's doing at S. Kubersky on Twitter, like you mentioned, and of course at touringplans.com and Orlando Weekly. If you want to find out what I'm doing, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com and read my latest post. Or you can subscribe to this podcast over on iTunes, or even better, if you're a fan, leave a rating or review on iTunes. And if in case you noticed, we have some background music now, which was created by Adam Hookie, my brother-in-law, and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. And I hope you enjoyed that addition to the podcast. And thanks for listening, and I will talk to you all again very soon.